Nonfiction webinar entitled Emerging from the Darkness, Creative Writing About Loss and Grief. Presenting today's webinar are both Professor Leanna James Blackwell, Director of our MFA in Creative Nonfiction here at Bay Path University, and also Anne Pinkerton, our very own MFA 2016 graduate and published author. My name is Cheryl Kozakowski, and I'm the Senior Director of Graduate Admissions, also here at Bay Path University. Before I turn this webinar over to both Leanna and Anne, I would like to take a moment and orient you to this online webinar environment. Just under our welcome message is a questions box. You will see an empty box. You can type in your questions here, click send, and we will all be able to read these and respond to you at the end of the presentation. So not everyone on the webinar today is familiar with Bay Path University, so I'd like to give you a little bit of background information. We were established in 1897, and so we have a long history of providing educational opportunities for both women and men throughout the United States and internationally, offering both on-campus and online programs at the graduate level for men and women, and at the undergraduate level for women only. Accredited by the New England Association of Schools and Colleges, Bay Path University is a leader in education and offers a wide array of degrees that are focused on some of the most emergent careers, such as the MFA in Creative Nonfiction, of course, higher education, genetic counseling, leadership and negotiation, cybersecurity, and many, many more. A Bay Path University education empowers undergraduate women and graduate women and men to become leaders in their careers and communities with an innovative approach to learning that prepares students to flourish in a constantly changing world. Our over 30 online and on-ground graduate programs are perfect for the professionals and the pragmatists, for women and men juggling families and full-time jobs. In fact, 90% of our students work and attend graduate school at the same time. You're able to do so because we make your education as accessible and as manageable as possible. At Bay Path University, students receive a great deal of personal attention throughout the admissions process and during their experience as a student. Our professors are both practitioners and faculty and bring a wealth of knowledge and expertise to the classroom. In addition, they are committed to giving our students the best support and encouragement throughout their experience at Bay Path. Again, thank you for joining us today. And now it is my pleasure to turn the presentation over to Leanna and Anne. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. And I'm absolutely delighted to have you. Thank you for joining us. I have been wanting to have this particular conversation in a Hot Topics for some time now. It is such a huge and important topic, and so many of the students in the MFA and writers in the community are writing about this, and you are uniquely qualified to write about this and have a story that is unforgettable and compelling, and the process of getting there has been very rich for you, and I think could be enormously useful to our listeners. So I wanted to open by talking a little bit about how writing about loss is not only healing for the individual, but also how it creates literature that advances our understanding of the human condition. And there are many examples of this, so many that's impossible to list them all. But some of my favorites are Roger Rosenblatt, who wrote about his late daughter in Making Toast, Calvin Trillin writing about his late wife and about Alice, Cheryl Strayed's loss of her mother in Wild, and Joan Didion in The Year of Magical Thinking after her husband died. Writing is a key component for so many of us in coming to terms with the inevitable of loss. And yet there are challenges to facing the blank page and moving through the memories. It's different for everyone, but there are certain fundamentals and certain guidelines for writers doing this. I know that there's some things that you found helpful, Anne, and there are things that I found helpful. And what I'd like to do to begin with, would you mind sharing with your listeners a little bit about your own story of loss, just beginning with what happened and when was it?
Sure. So my big brother David, who was 12 years older than me, was professionally a successful radiologist, but his real passion was serious and competitive outdoor adventure, like mountain bike racing, ultramarathon running, kayaking, and then at some point he fell in love with adventure racing, which is a bit like a triathlon on steroids. It includes teams of 3 or 4 who have to use orienteering skills in order to make their way through race courses in the wilderness. And there are different legs of the course that have to be accomplished through a variety of disciplines, ranging from things like horseback riding to kayaking, whitewater rapids to mountaineering. And at some point, David got really interested in the climbing part and was eager to go off on a new athletic quest of his own, which is when he decided he wanted to climb all 54 of the 14ers, which are a range of mountains throughout Colorado that are 14,000 feet and higher. So he was always on some kind of athletic journey in the wilderness. And I actually didn't even know that that was what he was up to when I got the call that he'd gone missing. And after 2 days of searching, his body was found below one of the peaks. And later it came out that he had actually attempted to summit 3 14ers in one day, which is a huge endeavor, even for the most fit. Although the people that knew him felt he was totally up to the challenge. But unfortunately, he didn't. Something happened, and no one really knows since he was alone, but he ended up falling about 200 feet and died instantly. So that was about, it'll be 10 years this September.
And I'm so sorry. I know what a shock that was to you and to the entire family.
Right.
And I too have had an experience with sudden loss, quite different, because it was with my mother, and she wasn't young like your brother, but she was in her early 70s and very healthy, and had gone in for a routine back surgery, but contracted an infection, which does happen more often than people realize in hospitals. And the infection spread to her body, and she died 2 weeks later. And the shock of that is something I will always remember. So, and I've written about it too. But I want to go back to you and your brother and this story. And when you knew that you needed to write about it, was that something that happened for you right away? Did you need to take time? How did you approach writing?
Well, it's funny. David was such an extraordinary guy that when he first died, I had this fantasy that I would write his biography. Um, but I was really in the middle of so much processing that I couldn't even begin to attempt that. And a really close friend at work who saw me struggling mentioned that she had been part of a bereavement writing group. And I should mention I was a writer before I attended the MFA program. I had studied poetry writing at Hampshire College as an undergrad. So I'd spent a lot of my adult life processing things through writing. So that was appealing to me. And so I joined this really incredible group that met once a week for 10 weeks. And we wrote about our losses, our pain. We wrote about our anger and our suffering and the sense that we had that other people didn't understand what we were going through. So it was a very immediately therapeutic experience in terms of just finding a way to deal with, as you said, the shock, but also with the confusion about what had happened, and also processing a lot of things that I could never have anticipated in terms of the fact there was the issue that people found out my brother died and instantly asked about my mother and whether he had kids. And there was a sense that I sort of wasn't entitled to my own suffering. So it was a really helpful time to get started.
Mm. Yeah, that is one of the things that we have talked about. And I remember when you first came into the MFA, mentioning that sibling loss isn't written about as much, very difficult to find books about it, and not understood as something legitimate in its own right, and that it requires the same amount of grieving and the same amount of processing as any other loss.
Absolutely. I've both read and written about what I sort of call the hierarchy of loss, in which we tend in our culture to deal very badly with death and dying and grieving in general. But there are certain kinds of losses that we tend to act as though they're not as serious somehow. And I felt very strongly that that sense of illegitimacy was really unfair. Um, and that was in part because I looked for books about sibling loss, and there were really precious few on the market, and many of them dealt with the psychology about it and called it a disenfranchised loss. So I felt sort of validated in feeling that people weren't necessarily taking it as seriously as I liked. But the more I read in my groups with the bereavement groups, the more people were really responding to it, and I finally ended up in a group where there were other people who had lost siblings, and I think they were just so grateful to have somebody else speak to the experience they were going through. And when I realized that others were having that kind of resonance, and that what I was putting out there wasn't just my own navel gazing, but was rather something that I realized could be helpful to other people, I suddenly realized there might be a larger purpose for the work that I was doing. It started to feel bigger. And so by my fourth bereavement writing group, at which point I had to start introducing myself as a repeat offender, uh, I really started to think that maybe I was also outgrowing the group, and that my writing on this topic really wanted to go somewhere else. And simultaneously, as the universe will sometimes throw things in our way, I had applied for a job at Bay Path. And during my interview, someone mentioned to me that an MFA in creative nonfiction was about to be launched. And though I didn't get the job, I ended up thinking and thinking and thinking about this program, and realizing that though I had never really had the plan to go back to graduate school, that was really because I couldn't figure out what I would want to do. And suddenly the answer was right in front of me. And mind you, this was almost 20 years after I had graduated from Hampshire. And I got laid off soon after, which sort of gave me this opening in my own brain space to start thinking about, wow, maybe graduate school could really happen. And that is when I ultimately met you. And you got on the phone with me and we talked about what I was working on, and I felt very much an imposter. I felt that there was no way that I was going to be good enough for this program, and there was no way that anyone else was really going to see the point in this story. And you really felt like there was value to it. You were excited, and within 2 weeks, I sent you a bunch of pages, and then I was in the MFA.
I remember that very well. And whatever forces in the universe made you arrive here, I am grateful to them. And it's funny that you
Ditto.
the imposter, because it never occurred to me for 1 second when I read your pages. I remember clearly the way I felt reading and thinking, two things. This person has a really important story to tell, and this person can write, and I cannot wait to work with her. And I've worked with you now. We worked together very closely for that first year, and it was a great pleasure, if pleasure is the right word, in talking about your memoir, but I think it is, because seeing a writer begin to shape and craft a narrative about something so painful and turn it into a thing of beauty is remarkable. And it happens rarely. And it reminds me a little bit, your journey. There is a wonderful interview in the most recent issue of Creative Nonfiction, which I know you subscribe to, Anne, and I think most creative nonfiction writers, if they don't, ought to. And this is in the Writer at Work series. It's an interview with a writer named Heather Sellers. And she talks about writing about loss and trauma. And she said, I had to spend some years writing it all out, spilling over, showing people, learning it was too soon to show, still being processed and observed by self, which reminds me of the years that you spent in the bereavement writing group. And then she goes on to say, and then some more years thinking, reflecting, going over the many pages, and trying to come to terms with three key generative questions. What's the point of sharing this? What's the purpose of reading it? What was it I really wanted to give over to my reader? And I think that when you came into the program, you were starting to ask those questions about how that might help others who are grappling with either a similar loss or any loss at all. And I think that you have found a way to do that in your memoir.
Thank you.
I wonder, how long, Anne, did you need to be silent as well? Did you find that you started writing soon after? Was there a long period of silence? Were there periods of silence in between? Can you talk about that?
Sure. Yes and yes. There was a delay at the beginning because I really didn't know what to do with my feelings. I think that the group ultimately sort of cracked open some of the things that I needed to deal with. But I absolutely agree that the suddenness and the immediacy of the experience meant that I was not writing pieces that were fit for public consumption. They were very much just sorting through my family story, my personal feelings, what was going on around me, and so I did dip in and out of writing about it for a long time. So it ended up being 6 years between the loss of my brother and actually being in the MFA program. So there was really a long span there that was just living and processing and doing a lot of private writing and not sharing it with anybody. There was a lot of that going on for a long, long time.
I think that's very important, and I think it's common. Anne Hood, after she lost her young daughter, didn't write a word for 2 years. And she'd been a very prolific and widely published writer, and she stopped and went into a period of silence. But out of that silence, eventually came a memoir that's been read by millions about her experience. And it's a beautiful piece of work. And she's gone on to write many more. But there was that long silence. And, Melanie Brooks, we've talked about her. She's a wonderful writer. And she was a previous guest, and she came out with a book called Writing Hard Stories, which is not specifically about loss, but it touches on it. Writing about trauma and loss is certainly that. And she interviews a number of writers about their process. And, Richard Hoffman is another example. He took 15 years to write his first memoir. And I think it's very important, and I emphasize that often with writing students who are grappling with difficult material. There is no rush, and the periods of silence can be generative as well. They can give the psyche, the soul, the heart, the mind time to regroup, to refresh, to replenish before coming back again. I remember when I tried to start writing about my mother within a few months, and I wrote the draft of a piece, and it was just way, way, way too soon.
Right.
And I realized that I couldn't. It was before I could even think about shaping it. It was raw, that spilling over, and that turned out to be the helpful part, just being able to spill over in a private way. And it sounds like you did very much the same thing.
I agree, absolutely. And I think I should put a shout out that that essay that you're speaking about is now a beautiful, long, braided story that's coming out in True Story this summer.
Yes, it is. And it took, thank you, Anne, and it took, see, it's going to be the fourth anniversary of her death soon. So that it took that long. And this is not a full-length memoir. This was just a sort of novella-length long essay. It took that long. I wrote many other things in between it and around it, but that particular piece took that long. And I'm glad that I didn't try to push it into shape too soon.
Right. I think the other thing that's really valuable about taking time is that once you get to the point where you're ready for eyes on it, it's not so vulnerable feeling. Because this kind of writing is so personal and so emotional and can feel a little fraught. For myself at least, I felt that it was extremely useful to get a tiny bit of distance before I started having people really talk to me about craft and voice and shaping and getting critical feedback on the work.
Mm. You anticipated my next question, which was what it was like to get literary feedback on it. Once you had started to think about it in terms of a work of art, to make that important leap between processing and then shaping a work of art, and then you began to share it with people who didn't know you, people who didn't know your story, and they were responding to it as literature. How did that help you, and what did it do for you in terms of your process, both as a person and as an artist?
Well, as I mentioned, at the end of that last bereavement writing group I did, I was really starting to feel like I needed the next level. So I felt like once I got into a workshop situation at Bay Path, I was really ready. That being said, there was a technique that we had utilized in the group that a couple of my early professors of the program also utilized, which was when we were referring to each other's work to use the term narrator, author, writer, something other than Anne or you, that there was this real inclination to treat the piece as something separate from the person, which makes it much easier to deal with critique. It does point out that this is now something that is supposedly going to be read by others, that it has a purpose beyond one's own processing. So it suddenly exists outside of you as well as inside. And so even though it can feel a little dodgy and a little sensitive sometimes, I found it extremely helpful to refer to people as the narrator in their stories because it treated it exactly like the work of literature that we are hoping to make it. So that was very helpful for me. And I think one of the great things about finally getting other people's eyes on it was understanding that a lot of the things that were very close to me and very crystal clear for me were not clear for others. There were parts of the story that really had to get opened up, especially regarding things like family members that just by the nature of what happened were involved in the storytelling. My understanding of who my brother is and what role he plays in the family is certainly not going to just be apparent to anybody else. And so just getting an outside perspective on things like that was very helpful. And some of the prompts that we used in several of the courses ended up offering kind of new ways to get into the story. I guess a good example is Mel Allen gave us a prompt about writing about place, and it was really just that complicated. It was place, put a story in a place that matters to you. And that ended up giving me the invitation to walk into this space that I hadn't really considered exploring in the story I was telling, but which is a park in Houston where I grew up and where my brothers grew up, and where my mother ultimately installed a memorial bench. And that was actually my first publication, was this story about a memorial bench in this park in Houston. And so that took me to a place in my head and my heart that I just hadn't gone. It opened all of these new avenues for me in terms of really ways to tell the story to somebody else.
I remember that piece. That was in River Sedge, wasn't it? And published
Right.
when you were still in the MFA.
Yep.
Yes. And I think that is such an important point about trying different ways into the story. And sometimes it's the questioning process with people that you are writing with who can help you do that. Place can be a very important way to do that. Sometimes it's a concept. For me, it was, I spend a lot of time writing and studying mythology and folklore for inspiration. And I had been working on that long essay about my mother's death for quite some time, but it wasn't until I was reminded of a particular myth about the rivers of the underworld. There are actually 5 of them, not one, as we tend to think, the river Styx, but there are 5, and one of those rivers is called the River Leve, and it's known as the River of Forgetting, that those who drink from it forget everything about their previous life. And once I remembered that image, the River of Forgetting, as a way of describing my mother's way of approaching life in general, and what was so mystifying sometimes about growing up with her, opened up the whole story. So it was just another way in. And
I think in that essay too that the River of Forgetting also has an interesting counterpoint to the narrator's remembering in the story. And so I think it serves in that way too.
And that's what we do, isn't it? We, as writers, we prioritize, we value, we give voice to those memories that otherwise we'd be carrying around privately for the rest of our lives. And by sharing them, I feel that we invite others not only into our own experience, but into theirs as well. They serve as an invitation. And I'm wondering, you talked about addressing some of the craft issues and finding different ways into your story. And I'm wondering, is there a certain way that it becomes a dialectical process? By addressing craft issues, do you sometimes find that it opens up something emotionally for you or helps you go deeper?
Absolutely. I think that sometimes when people had questions about missing parts of the story, when I would address them, I ended up revisiting things that I hadn't even considered. It provoked memories that I had completely forgotten were actually lodged in my brain somewhere. It definitely gave the story more facets. It made it, I think, made it richer in terms of ensuring that some of the things any reader would question had been anticipated and addressed, but also that it did take me places that I really didn't know I needed to go. And I think memory, we talk about memory in the program a lot because it's so faulty, and yet it's so telling. But there were so many ways that I started addressing constructive feedback, trying to craft pieces, trying to shape them to be as clear and compelling as possible. And I would actually realize that I was remembering deep long forgotten things from my childhood, from my family, about my brother and who he was. It was really a pretty fascinating, almost hypnotic process.
I remember very well the process of that happening and the new memories being generated as you started to work on it during the first year and then the second year, and how much more, how deeply the piece expanded, and the sections that you hadn't even anticipated writing when you first came in because you hadn't yet accessed that memory, and
Right.
the connections that you started to make. And I think we find that as writers, that by going from the personal writing into craft writing, it sort of leads us back again to a deeper understanding of the personal relationship with the material. But as you say, with enough distance that you can handle it a little better. It's maybe not quite as raw.
Mm-hmm.
I'm reminded again of the interview that I was talking about with Heather Sellers, and this was a quote that I wanted to include in today's conversation because you're touching on it. And she talks about beauty, which is, there's a bit of an irony there because the experiences are far from beautiful. They're horrible. They're devastating. And so how can one write about something like that and make it beautiful, and why should you? I think that's a question that I asked as I began that process of writing about my mother. But she says, when writing about painful or difficult subjects, grief, illness, violence, loss, writers tend to put in only what's expected: the doctor giving a terminal diagnosis, the sterile impersonal hospital, the accident. And Sellers calls this the bus of expected things. But she goes on to say that to write about dark subjects, writers should remember what's beautiful the entire time, not literal beauty, but rather the layering of artistic techniques and the alchemy of fusing many different elements to create art. That beauty becomes a container for complexity. She calls it a great thing and a terrible thing set alongside each other, which helps us achieve some kind of basic fluency with not knowing and questions and the ability to tolerate uncertainty. That the beauty or the beautiful and the terrible together, that the tension that exists between those two is a deeper and more accurate description of the way we live our lives than the trauma alone. And it also allows a reader to come into the story. And I think that I was reminded of this because of your book, Anne, and I feel that that is very much what you do. Create the beauty out of this pain and make it an experience that, while not easy, is so rich and so fulfilling to read about. I can't imagine now not having read it.
Well, thank you. That's extremely kind. Uh, I I do think there is a lot to be said for not just documenting the hard things. I mean, that's clearly part of what people need as a backstory almost just to get into it. But one of the things that I've been sort of chewing on lately is this issue that I think some people in my sphere often look at the fact that I've been writing about my brother for almost a decade and sort of wonder if I'm just not getting over it or if I have not found some kind of closure.
Mm.
Um, and I, first of all, don't really believe in closure at this point, but I also realize that I've decided not to close this in a very conscious way, for exactly two reasons. And one is that I actually like thinking about my brother. I really like keeping him with me, and I think that's part of what I didn't realize would be an outcome of doing this work. But I loved him so much that I feel like it's quite amazing to me how much I've learned about him after he's been gone and how much better I know him now, which is a strange, strange thing to say, but it's a really valuable experience. And the other reason that I keep doing it is because I feel like people need to know what it's like to lose siblings and need to know that when they do, they aren't alone, that someone else has been there and done it and survived. I think that's part of the beauty in it too, is yes, it is traumatic. Yes, it's really hard. It has all kinds of implications on your life, everyone in your family, your spouse, your friends, because it impacts you as a person so much. But if you can sort of turn that, it's a not to oversimplify it, but to turn it a little lemons into lemonade in terms of having the story, getting to own it, getting to shape it so that it's mine, getting to present it to people in a way that resonates them with in a kind of more universal feeling, even though it's my specific story. It gives me a huge amount of fulfillment to know that I can actually help my brother be remembered and help other people know him, but also to help them understand that they aren't alone, which is, after all, one of the primary reasons we love to read books.
Yes, it is. And I think that your point about enjoying this, about of being with your brother, bringing him closer to you, loving being with him and learning more about him as you started to write about him after his death, it
Mm-hmm.
makes perfect sense. Lisa Romeo, who teaches in our program, a lovely writer, she talks about the same thing in her memoir, which just came out, um, her book about starting with goodbye. And it is about coming to know a father better after he died, as she wrote about him. And it took many years, again, of piecing together her memories and talking to others in her family and learning about the context of his life in a way that she hadn't been aware of, and also having dream experiences. She feels
Mm,
that she knows him better now than she did then, and there's joy in that as well. And it's different from not letting go, which our culture is determined to do. We are very much all about you grieve and then you move on.
right.
And that is really not the way the human heart works. We do move on, but we move on with the people we love. We don't leave them behind.
Agreed.
And I wondered if we could talk a little bit about your experience then. We've talked about getting your essays ready and getting your work ready, sharing it with others, and then there's the publication part when it's out in the world. And you touched on that when talking about why we read and feeling less alone and helping others remember your brother. You've published in Modern Loss, in Hippocampus, in Cold Creek Review, in Right Angles Journal. And not all of those were about your brother. You've also written about a close friend of yours. So I wonder if you would mind spending some time sharing with us what it was like to see those pieces out in the world, what kind of feedback, if any, you got, and how that felt.
Sure. It's a great delight to have a piece accepted because it's so validating. But then you do have this issue of, ooh, there are eyes on it, and which is of course what you want, but it's also a little nerve-wracking when the actual experience on the page is yours. Um, I so I first published in River's Edge, as we mentioned, which is only a print publication, and that was good news and bad news. It's lovely to be in a hard copy collection. It does mean that almost nobody ever read it because we're such a digital society, and I didn't have anything digital to share. So it was kind of a perfect first piece. It's, as I mentioned, it's a piece about place. It's also not one of the more raw, vulnerable, painful pieces. So it felt a little bit safer to me in terms of a part of this particular story that was sort of made its way out into the world. Fast forward to this March when I had a much longer and much more challenging piece that was published in Hippocampus magazine, which is a long chapter from my thesis that is really about extreme adventure. And it really asks the question of why my brother was willing to take the kinds of risks that he did. So it also it brings in my mother, and it brings in personal research I was doing, and includes talking to a guy who worked in search and rescue. So that piece, in a way, really, really opened the floodgates in terms of the exploration that I do in this book. And because it was digital, I was able to share it online. And boy, did I get a lot of readers, which was delightful. And it's what we want as authors if we're interested in putting our work out there into the world. But it was also kind of incredible to me because I had friends and strangers alike saying, wow, I didn't know this happened, and this is such an intense experience. And I got really incredible feedback on that, in which I could track easily because, again, it was digital and it was online. But comments on my own social media channels that were incredibly kind about not only what I'd experienced, but about the work itself. And then perhaps even richer in some way, because it's the readership you don't know you'll ever have, were some comments from strangers that provided me with another kind of sense of the value, or at least potential value, of the work that I'm doing. One that comes to mind is a comment from a woman on the Hippocampus piece who happened to be a hiker and climber herself, who had had an accident and lost part of her leg. And she wrote me this really incredible note about how important it was for her to read the perspective of the people who loved the adventurers. And that was, a whole other audience that had never even occurred to me as I was writing. So that was very exciting. And I think to jump onto the modern loss piece that recently published, which was about having one of those social media moments where your deceased friend ends up in your inbox, and how incredibly disruptive and eerie that experience is, was also fantastically validating, for lack of a better word, that these stories mean something to someone else, because so many people chimed in saying, oh my gosh, me too. Oh, I get the birthday notification on Facebook and my friend's been gone for 2 years, or whatever. And then, really interestingly, I had a bunch of people say, yeah, they freaked me out at first too, and then I ended up liking it because I got to remember that person, which sort of circles back to this notion that remembering our loved ones that are gone is not necessarily a terrible, dark, or dysfunctional thing to do, that it can be really rewarding.
It can be deeply rewarding, and it's true that sometimes the way our memory is jogged can be startling, like social media. And I've had that same experience. I think, was yours a LinkedIn anniversary or something like that?
Yes.
Yes.
I was asked to congratulate my friend on a work anniversary, and she had been gone for 3 years. So that was incredibly bizarre.
You're right, and it can feel intrusive in the most extreme way, and yet in your piece it became an opportunity for you to reflect about your friend and to write about her, and like you say, to be with her again. And for our listeners, can people access that easily on the Modern Loss website as well as the Hippocampus?
I would think if anyone searched Pinkerton, it would come right up.
Excellent. It's a really different way of talking about how we remember and why we remember, and it's lovely and powerful.
Thank you.
And we have a few minutes left to continue our conversation, and then we're going to open it up for questions. So I wondered if we could talk about your plans for the memoir. I know that you are either finished or very close to, and that you just took a 4-week book proposal writing workshop with Suzanne Strepek Shea that you found helpful. And I wonder if you could talk a little about that.
Sure. Another wonderful offering from the Bay Path community. Suzanne Strepek Shea, who is the godmother of the program, offers a 4 weeks of writing each spring, and the subjects differ, but this time it was about book proposal writing, which was extremely helpful because I was struggling with getting that done myself on my own. And so Suzanne has published, I don't know, 14 or 15 books. She's really extremely accomplished and knowledgeable about the process. So I was grateful to be part of a small group of women working on proposals for a wide array of stories. And I have a really strong draft that needs some polishing, but the plan at this point is to get that ready to go, and make some final changes to the memoir itself. And I guess I'll throw in the fact that because I graduated in 2016 and I took quite literally a year away from even looking at the thesis, I went back to it with fresh eyes. And I know that not everyone can wait a year between revisions, but it was, and this was due to life circumstances that I just didn't, but I thought it was actually strangely valuable to get that much space away from it and then go back to it. So I've not only come up with a lot of revisions and tightening, but I've also added another, it will probably be 5 new chapters to fill it out when all is said and done. So my plan is to get everything polished up over the summer and start courting agents in the fall and see if there's anyone out there who would like to help me see this get out into the world.
Well, I think speaking for myself, but I'm imagining speaking for everybody who's joined us here today, we hope that happens, and I personally am confident that it will.
Thank you.
I've been picturing your book on the bookshelves.
Oh,
Absolutely. I do think that there's something very important that it has to offer the world. I thought we would end our conversation on this quote that I know you love too, Anne. This is Anne Lamott writing in her book, Grace, Thoughts on Faith. And she says, "There are deaths I have not gotten over, but somehow over time, the acute helplessness of death has become merely painful."
fantastic.
That's fantastic. And I would say, for me at least, it's not always painful now. I sometimes have that pleasure that I didn't have in the acute stage of remembering my mother and thinking, "Hi, Mom, you're here."
Mm-hmm.
And I have that sometimes several times a day. It's something, a piece of music that she would have loved. And she'll be right there. And
Right.
pleasurable thing. And thank you so much. We could continue talking about this, but I want to make sure that our participants have a chance to ask you any questions. So we're going to open it up. Generally, we leave a little moment to give people a chance to gather their thoughts. So anybody have questions for Anne or for me? Happy to answer.
And we do. Thank you so much. We do have some comments. May students share their perspectives along the way? Okay, yes, we do have an opportunity right now for students to share their perspectives at the end of the presentation. So please feel free to type in your questions and perspectives at this point so that we can certainly go ahead and share those with everyone. So we do have a comment and some questions from Naomi. Thank you to you both, and so sorry for your losses. This is an excellent, helpful conversation, and I can relate to disenfranchised loss of a sibling. I have lost 2 friends to cancer and so carry them with me and have had similar social media experiences. And truth be told, I still have emails and texts I hold on to. I love your message about non-closure. When people die, they are still with us, I believe. And as writers, it is hard to know where to put them when you feel alone with the loss. Perhaps that's why we write about them, as you have with your brother. I like the idea of invitation in silence. Quote from Heather reminds me of juxtaposition, which I strive to consider in stories, the tension. Thanks, Leanna, for sharing that. And excuse me. And can you say more about letting go of the imposter self to allow the story to take hold? Can you say more about the process of writing truths and memories about the other family members and their responses, feedback, and how you handled owning your own story and others' reaction to it? Thank you, Naomi, and good luck.
Excellent question. Anne?
Yeah, thank you, Naomi. That's so thoughtful and so poignantly written. Wow. So in terms of owning it, this is really, I think it's one of the hardest things when you write about family, and it can be extremely fraught. And I would be disingenuous if I told you I had it all figured out. Um, I will say I clutched to my bosom something that our friend Melanie Brooks said in a presentation that she gave, which was, this is your story. And if they want to tell their own version of it, so be it. And I think it's been extremely important for me to remember that my memories and the way I experience something are legitimate and that they belong to me and that nobody else really gets to say anything about that. They get to say something about the writing and the craft, but they don't get to question the way I felt or the way I experienced something or the way I remembered something. I sometimes think our subconscious has us remember things a certain way for a reason. And even if it isn't, journalistically accurate, it still has its own truth because of the way that we stored it away in our memory banks. And there's also another Anne Lamott quote that is, if your family wanted you to write about them more warmly, then they would have behaved better.
I love that.
One can be very helpful as you go. That being said, when I write about family, I work really, really hard to be compassionate and sensitive to them as human beings and not use my writing to villainize anybody, but rather, my family is in this memoir because they have to be. It isn't a complete story without the roles they played. And I will say that I have people in my family who remember things extremely differently than I do, and some who deny that certain things even happened. And that can be extremely challenging to deal with. But I think at the end of the day, you just have to trust your own sense of what happened. And because even if it isn't something that someone can fact check, it's still true to you. And going back to the imposter syndrome, because I think so many creative people wrestle with that one. I will say one of the best and most vital things for feeling legitimate about the work that I do in my writing is actually getting readers. And I know a lot of people don't care about publishing. I'm certainly not in it for the fame and fortune, but I'm in it because it gives me validation that my story means something and that I can do this. So I know how difficult it is to put yourself out there and deal with the rejections, which you get mountains of, along with a few acceptances. But once you get an acceptance and you have eyes on your work and people saying that this meant something to them, it makes it all worth it. The minute that you realize you made somebody understand something in a way they hadn't imagined before, or that they felt like you really got what they were going through, it's like gold. It's what you do it for. Or it's what I do it for anyway. And so that has helped me with my imposter syndrome. That being said, it comes back all the time and I have to beat it off with a stick.
The good news, if it is good news, is that writers who've published many, many books will still have that feeling.
Mm.
So it's not as though you need to even worry that you have that and think, well, if I have this feeling, it means I'm really not ready or I'm not a writer. It doesn't at all. It might mean, in fact, that you are, because sometimes that self-doubt is part of the way writers think. To doubt things is to question things, and to question things makes you a better writer. For me, just to add to what you said, Anne, about readers, I published a piece recently about a traumatic event, and one of the comments on it said, "Thank you for this. This was like medicine for me."
Wow.
It wasn't anything about, oh, this is the best writing. She wasn't talking about that. And it was just this one comment. There were many others, but I remember that one. That one person that I didn't know who responded to it by saying, "This is like medicine for me," made it all worthwhile.
Right.
And removed any doubts about what I was doing. And sometimes it just takes one person to read it and to say that, to respond.
Agreed. It's powerful stuff.
Other questions?
We do. We do have a question, more of a comment and question in one. I'll kind of paraphrase from Pat. Would like to know more about the MFA program in general and the upcoming start dates and the different tracks, and how she can tie in what she's learned on the webinar today and to focus on that in what she could create as her thesis as a culmination of the MFA program in the end. If you could explain more about that, Leanna.
I certainly can. I will say that could be a longer conversation for me to go into detail, and I'd be happy to follow up with either a phone call or email conversation. But briefly, our next start date is August 27th. Our program is accelerated 2 years, although most people who have active outside lives will take a little longer to do it. And that is 2 courses per semester. There are a series of required core courses. Mentorship Lab is the first series, and that's the series that Anne was in with me the first year, in which writers are placed with an instructor and a group and move through together. So it forms a strong foundation for a community. And then there are a number of electives within the program, including spiritual writing, health and wellness writing, contemporary women's stories, the personal profile, and the final year is the writing of the thesis, and that's a 2-semester course in which writers work with a thesis director and both polish and refine the work that they've created up until that point, and also do new writing, often to fill in gaps in the narrative and to form it so that it's a whole coherent story. And that can be in the form of an essay collection, linked essays, or one story. So Anne, you, for instance, wrote what it would be called, the classical memoir, a story that is, it's the same story with different angles, and the chapters aren't necessarily always chronological, but tells the same story. And others have numerous stories to tell, but they're linked by a particular theme. And the thesis is generally worked out with a student at about halfway through the program, because a lot of writers come in feeling that they do know what they want to write about and change their minds, or they come in not quite sure. So we recommend taking a few classes first, and then by the 3rd Mentorship Lab class in the first year, it sort of functions as a pre-thesis in which students start to get a sense of, okay, this is what I'm writing about, this is my topic, now how might I organize it? And our instructors work with our students to help them with that. And as I said, happy to answer any more questions if anyone has them about the MFA. Shoot me an email. All my information is on the website, and Cheryl can also share it with you. I should also mention we do have a 1-week seminar. Some students have taken that as a way to get a feeling for what it might be like to be in the MFA without having to commit to it. And that is a 1-week seminar in Ireland, which we do every year. It's led by Suzanne Strepek Shea and Tommy Shea. with many guest writers and artists, including Anne Hood and Dinty Moore, and that's coming up July 28th, and it will run for a week through August 4th. So I have more information about that too. Okay. We might have another minute for maybe.
Great. We do have another comment and some possibly some questions. I'm going to read through this. Well, another one from Naomi. One more. Does Anne have a writing schedule or a routine to share?
Anne, do you?
Yeah, about that. So I have a really demanding job and I do freelance work. So fitting the writing in is always a challenge. I will say that I get into really good jags and then I lose them. But when I'm doing it well, I go to my regular day job. I get home about 5. I like to walk my dogs for about a mile, which I find to be an incredible head clearing kind of transition from my work day to my personal evening. And then I could go write for half an hour to an hour. When I'm doing that at least 5 days a week, I feel super productive and really good about my writing life. I would be lying if I told you that happened all the time. One of the things that we talked about at great length in the program was how do we keep this up without the structure? And I really feel like it takes a great amount of accountability to oneself. And some people find that they get up first thing in the morning and, do 15 minutes or 2 hours or whatever they have. I happen to really not be a morning person at all. And so that didn't work for me the few times I thought I was going to invent this brilliant new habit, but I think it's different for everybody. I just happen to find that little space between my work day and my dinner and husband time was a really good slot. So I do feel like those of you out there who are trying to make this happen with a day job, it totally can happen, but it might mean, writing on your lunch break. It might mean, taking 15 minutes here and there. I mean, it's surprising what you can get accomplished in 15 minutes if you're really dedicated to it. So I don't believe anymore that no one has time because I'm a really busy person and I still make time. Again, not as often as I want to, but I still make regular time. So I would encourage you to find, whatever your sort of personal rhythm is and then just dedicate yourself. And if you have to, bribe yourself with something nice after you do it as a little reward. But I find that the writing itself really becomes its own reward once I just get it done.
Excellent advice, Anne. Thank you. We need to close now. I'm wondering, Anne, if there are further questions that come in and people might like to hear more from you, can I forward those to you via email? And would you be willing to continue the conversation with anybody who's still got a question?
I absolutely would. I welcome it wholeheartedly. I'm a huge fan of this program, as people can probably glean, and I would be happy to talk about Bay Path or my experience or writing about loss or whatever.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. What
My
a pleasure it was to talk to you, as always.
Thank you, and you too.
Great. Thank you so much to both you. I realize there's a few more slides here. I apologize. I thank you so much to both you, Leanna and Anne, for doing the webinar today and really appreciate it. And please stay tuned, everyone, to the next webinars in our series of hot topics in creative nonfiction, as we will have more coming up in our series. And have a wonderful day. And we will be sending out a recording of the webinar today to everyone who is on it and to those who weren't able to attend as well. So for those of you who were here, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules, I'm sure, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Cheryl.
Thank you so much.
Thanks all.
Take care.
Anne.